What's up, everyone? Here we go. Another nice new edition of Celtics Beat. We've got a lot to cover. Evan Valenti is back with us, which is nice. He just couldn't stand the thought of working with Chris Forsberg last week, so he bowed out. He said, nope, not today. I'm not doing it. I'm out.
I'm just checking Twitter right now to make sure we're not going to miss any breaking news at this point, because this just happens to be a thing all the time. And we have a show either during the recording or after the recording. Some sort of breaking news happens. Luckily, last week we caught it in time. So far, Adam, we're good. We're good.
All right. Well, monitor that. I'm sure something will come out of the Hall of Fame press availability as we're chatting at Mohegan Sun. Paul Pierce will say something incredibly controversial, and we'll react to that in the final 10 minutes of our show. Ian Thomsen is back with us, good friend of the program. Ian, how are you? How's the summer been?
Oh, it's been great. I've been indoors all the time. It's been great.
Like all of us, right?
Just been terrific. Yeah. But actually, it's been really good.
Three of us really good tans coming at you if you're watching on video.
Crushing it. Adam, I think you might have the best tan currently. And you're like,
It's the lighting. It's entirely the lighting.
I spray it on.
I have that tan filter. You guys didn't know you could. The pandemic has done wonders for creating content at home. You can go out, you can get the spray tan filter and put it on your camera. You can. I'm albino looking right now. You wouldn't know it though.
I'm a ghost, so It's all right. I've accepted it. It's fine. It's good.
We've got a lot going on. Of course, the biggest news involving the Celtics in recent days. It's huge. Luke Garnett on whatever the Exhibit 10 contract. He's coming back. It looks like he's cut. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Luke Garnett. Quite frankly, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Juan Hernan Gomez either. Although, of course, that was the trade that we discussed a little bit last week with Chris Forsberg after it did break. Ian, the big thing, and it's part of the reason that we wanted to have you on this show in particular is you being so well versed in the league, in the history of the league, the Celtics organization, and covering the team and league as a whole so intently. NBA.com, Sports Illustrated, among other outlets, during Paul Pierce's reign in Boston, in New England, before landing with Brooklyn and Washington, the Clippers, and bouncing around a little bit there at the end. It's Hall of Fame induction weekend coming up here on Saturday as we chat right now, and this is really. It's not entirely, obviously, but it's a real Celtics feel to this class. The headliner, the biggest name, is obviously Paul Pierce. He'll be presented by his old teammate, good buddy, and a very recent Hall of Famer as well, and Kevin Garnett, only, technically in the 2020 class, but only inducted in recent months. These two classes coming back to back here. And, also as part of the class, not Celtics related, but you got Chris Webber and you have Ben Wallace and you have who else? Chris Bosh. There are some big names in this class, another star-studded class, not quite to the level of Garnett and Tim Duncan and Kobe Bryant, obviously, but there are some big names in this class. But from a Celtics feel, there's Pierce, there's Bill Russell now going in as a coach, there's Mike Gorman, obviously, long overdue. Quite frankly, the late great Tommy Heinsohn should have been in there a long time ago as a commentator. That still has not happened. So there's a lot that we can jump into here, and you really are a perfect guy to help us do it. So I'm eager. How much do you just like this time of the year in general, and getting to kind of go back through the annals of NBA history and watch the speeches and go back and look at old clips on YouTube and just take the trips down memory lane?
Yeah, I think it's a really important time for the NBA because it's the most current of our leagues, right? I mean, baseball, they're always thinking about the past, and they may go back 100 years to compare one player to another. Same in football, not to the same extent as baseball, but people go back and they talk about the old football players. But in basketball, I don't know, before Bird and Magic, it's sort of like people act like it never happened, or if the film is in black and white, well, that's got nothing to do with what's going on. I mean, even Julius Erving seems left out of today's conversation. That's how current and in the moment the NBA is. And so this is a great time for a perspective and to realize there is a bigger picture to it. And yeah, the league has changed, but all the leagues change, all the sports change. The NFL football is a lot different now than it used to be. Baseball's a lot different now. Basketball is too. And so I think it's a great time of year, and it's especially good for a franchise like the Celtics, who built so much of their success in the old era. And for me, it's a really big mistake to not give credit to that era, because basically it laid the foundation for everything we're seeing now. I mean, Bill Russell's going in as a coach, but what he really did was lay down the foundation for what a great player should be. You know, it could have gone one way or the other. It could have been a great player has to be individually dominant, as Wilt Chamberlain was. But no, we think now a great player has to be a guy that plays both ends of the court and leads his team by example and wins championships. That's what a great player has to be. Michael Jordan saw it that way. He was the greatest individual of all time, but he saw that he had to be more like Bill Russell than Wilt Chamberlain. So I think for the Celtics, for a guy Paul Pierce was forced to take on that point of view, and Kevin Garnett really saved his career and turned it around and made it possible that he is an authentic Hall of Famer. If he had not played with Kevin Garnett, I think he'd still be in the Hall of Fame, but I don't think we'd be talking about Paul the same way.
Well, he'd be a Hall of Famer, I guess, in the same way that like Carmelo Anthony will be a Hall of Famer, right?
Yes.
You know, that it's like he'll be there, that he'll have a lot of volume numbers, but didn't ultimately have that thing, that title, that ring that puts him over the top. And obviously Paul Pierce will forever be associated, as he should be, with Banner 17 and winning in 08 and being Finals MVP and all of it. But you're right, you know, it's easy to forget, as much as it's been written about lately. And Chris Mannix had a great chat with Paul Pierce, an interview for you know, your former home there, SI, during the week, talking about Pierce saying that, you know, he wanted out, he wanted to go to Dallas, he wanted, you know, they won this three-headed monster with Dirk and Jason Kidd. Mark Cuban added, I don't know if you know anything about this, I certainly did it, and I don't think this has really been discussed nearly enough, actually. Cuban had said that he tweeted out, there was a really interesting wrinkle to this, that they had talked trade. It was a 3-team deal, Boston, Dallas, and another team that evidently is the one that killed it, where Paul Pierce would have been dealt to Dallas after they won in 08, which, you know, kind of floors me. I mean, before, you know, years prior, when Pierce publicly wanted out and was upset, and obviously Danny Ainge went and got Ray and got KG and turned things around and created the new Big Three era, you know, before all that happened, that makes sense. But this prospective deal that Cuban tweeted about happening post 08 sort of blew my mind.
Yeah, you know, what was interesting, it just came out just a little while ago. Mark Stein, who writes a terrific column that's now on Substack, actually, and I suggest everybody subscribe to it. He lives in Dallas and is very well connected there. And his impression is that those talks actually happened in 2006 now, that people around the Mavericks believe it goes back to 2006. And at that time, there was a lot of trade talk around Paul Pierce. You know, he was going to be traded for the rights to Chris Paul, or the Blazers were interested in trading for him. And, you know, Danny was a young GM and wasn't afraid to trade anybody. And it's a good thing for Danny didn't trade Paul Pierce, but there was a lot of talk. There was a lot of fluidity to the Celtics back then. No one could have seen it coming. I remember talking with Paul about a year and a half before the Garnett trade, just over at the practice facility, the old one. And he was being optimistic, actually, and it surprised me a bit. And he said, you know, just one player could change everything for us here. And I'm like, who could do that? He said, like Kevin Garnett. And I said, how are you going to get Kevin Garnett? He goes, I don't know, but what if we could trade for Kevin Garnett? And I was making the mistake of undervaluing all the young players the Celtics had at that time. I didn't think they could scrounge together enough to get Garnett, much less Garnett and Ray Allen, and I undervalued them. I actually remember having an argument with Steve Bulpett at the time, a while after that, and Steve very much thought they had enough young talent to make big trades, and I just didn't see it. So I give Steve credit.
You might have also undervalued Kevin McHale being in charge in Minnesota.
Yeah, and also the Timberwolves saying that they wanted to trade him Kevin would not have been traded unless the Timberwolves had said they wanted to. He had to be talked into it.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't have happened either. I don't think anybody could have seen that you would openly want to get rid of a guy that was a league MVP and really mirrored everything you should want in a team, defense first and unselfishness and all that, and fight and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, so there was a lot of talk around Paul Pierce at that time. And I know that he soured on them. He told me the summer after, I did a big story for Sports Illustrated, a cover story that explained how they'd made the trades for Ray Allen and Kevin. And that was the first time where Paul had said, look, I wanted out. And I went to them and asked for a trade. And Danny and Wick and Steve brought me together and said, look, this is what we're going to try to do. Please give us a chance to see what we can do this summer. And that turned out to be the best summer. The two things that happened that summer were the best thing. They were the trades, but before that, it was filling in the lottery, right? Because if they'd won the draft lottery as they thought they might, they would have ended up with Kevin Durant or Greg Oden. And then, they probably would have traded Paul Pierce. They would have started over around this young talent that they just drafted, but instead they dropped to 5th. Their draft pick had no value, and it became an asset for them to trade to try to get older players of Paul's age. So that was actually the biggest move of all, was losing in the lottery that year.
I'll let Evan go in a sec here, but just on the Mannix article, there were so many great pieces to this, things that Paul Pierce said, whether it was obviously further dissecting the parting from ESPN and the fact that, when he was, canned for that Instagram video, which he deleted or it expired, however exactly it works on Instagram right away, but people had recorded it, put it out on social, and then, it lived on in infamy from that point. But, he said he refused to apologize, even when some people were concerned that it could hinder his Hall of Fame case. Obviously, he didn't want to be at ESPN anymore. He was tired of talking about LeBron James and unable to be himself, and didn't want to travel as much, and all the different components to that. The video itself, being a divorce guy, he, obviously there was some pretty women in the video. He's out and smoking, wasn't doing anything, as he said, not doing anything illegal, but wasn't the best look, wasn't the best representation, the best image, all the things that we just talked about in terms of him wanting out of Boston, how he wound up in Boston back in the draft, and how he felt to them, and Rick Pitino really not scouting him and almost panicking and afraid to pick him. There were a lot of facets to this piece, this expose of Pierce, that I thought were really interesting. Did anything strike you in particular, even having covered him up close?
Just that he wasn't going to apologize for that video, and I think he's finally to the point where he's never been the perfect quote role model as a player, and the guy that he's always been on the edge in a lot of different ways. Paul has, and yet when he came to the Celtics and Doc became the coach and they butted heads, he came around. And then when you thought he was a selfish player and all he cared about was scoring, then Kevin Garnett came and he came around again, and he emulated everything Kevin wanted him to do and became a very good defensive player and really one of the best shot blockers at his position in the NBA, Paul, and would do everything for the team, became team first and not worrying about his stats. So yeah, on the one hand, he just seems very comfortable with himself now. Whatever you're going to think of me, I don't care, because I've shown who I really am. And if that's not good enough for you, well, then it really doesn't matter anyway. He's got to feel like he overcame a guy that fell in the draft, a guy that didn't have the best reputation as a player, was seen as selfish. In his mind, I'm sure he's proven all of that wrong. And he's won a championship, and it's the only championship they've won for decades. And so I just think I just see that article as affirming this is a guy that just doesn't really care what you think of him, because he's put up his record and there it is.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get probably more into like, the undervalued, overvalued career of Paul Pierce and where he rightfully stands amongst the NBA greats, not only of his generation, but of course, people in the past. But I thought it interesting you talk about when KG comes over and, it basically changes the entire fortune of the franchise and is, leaked into, this particular current iteration of the Celtics. There's a lot of positivity and there's a lot of expectations now considering what, they went through with those guys and then the transition to what it is now. I mean, Pierce technically and Kevin and they have an impact, an imprint on the Celtics team because of that Nets trade. I mean, you can't not talk about Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown without thinking obviously about the two guys before him. And I think Jason Terry was in that deal too. It's Jet. Yeah. Okay. So you can also think
new head coach, right? Isn't he a coach somewhere?
Yeah. I'm pumped for Jet, man. That guy was awesome. I loved watching him. The wings coming out. I love that guy. That was great. But the one thing I like, and I think this particular current Celtics team might, you get over last season, which was an absolute, dumpster fire in terms of what they expected it to be versus what actually ended up happening, and considering all the injuries covered, all that stuff. They could maybe take a picture out of Paul's, a chapter out of Paul's book, so to speak. And you mentioned it, Ian, about how when KG came over, Paul was very willing to say, you know what? This might be the guy that needs to be our vocal leader, not me. And maybe I need to be the guy who's been here the longest that buys in first so the rest of the team buys in. We all talk about chemistry. We had Chris on last week. We got a little flack for, can Dennis Schroeder hurt the Celtics chemistry because he's going to be gunning a little bit for his own stats and trying to get himself a new contract. Could that hurt with this team's chemistry? That's a huge issue for this team this year. And then, if they decide to add a Bradley Beal or a Dame Lillard or a Zach LaVine or X player later, it's still going to be an issue. So you look at Paul Pierce and say, yeah, you might have been a little selfish early on, but when it came down to it, the most important thing in his career, accepting Kevin Garnett, letting him kind of be the vocal leader in the locker room, so to speak, and following his example, Paul did that without any questions. And I think Paul could be a great example. And I think he's been a mentor in some regard. I'm not sure exactly the amount or what level to the new guys, to Jason and Jaylen. I mean, there's that great picture of Paul Pierce, high-fiving Jason Tatum after Tatum makes a huge shot. I love that photo. It's just like the old guard, the new guard coming together for a real quick snapshot. I do believe this Boston team can look at the career of Paul Pierce and what he has been able to accomplish over his career and say, yeah, he was a hell of a scorer. He was an all-star for so many years early in his career, but it was the unselfishness of him later on that really made him an NBA champion. I think this particular group could use that as an example to maybe fuel them and use that to maybe, set an example for what they need to do the next step of their career as they get older into their primes.
Yeah, there were all sorts of little important things going on in that dynamic among those three guys, and especially with Kevin and Paul. And I mentioned that story I did on how they put together the trade, and it was on the cover of SI for the preview issue for that season, which turned out to be their championship year. And it's a picture of their big three, and Garnett's in the middle, and he's the bigger figure. He's walking towards the camera, and he's ahead of the other two. And so the picture tells you that he's the main guy. But if you look at Kevin Garnett in the picture, his thumb down by his hip is pointing to the side. It's pointing at Paul Pierce. And what he's telling you, the viewer, he's saying, this is really the guy. He's pointing to Paul. This is really the Celtic. This is going to be our leading scorer. And so in all sorts of ways, you saw all that year, Kevin Garnett making clear to everybody that Paul Pierce, that he was saying, in my mind, Paul Pierce is the guy. Paul's been here forever. He's our original Celtic. He's going to lead us in scoring. So he showed this respect to Paul all the time. And it really made a difference. I just think about the blending of cultures there that happened and how it applies to what the Celtics are hoping to achieve this year. And it's sort of why I'm really optimistic about the Celtics team. I think they're going to win more games than maybe Vegas thinks, because you see it in sports all the time when you've got two cultures meeting and both of them want to win, but neither one knows how. So you've got Jason and Jalen and those guys, and it was dysfunctional last year, and you could see the frustration in them, but they didn't know how to fix it. Well, now you have this new coach come in who comes from the Spurs system, who speaks directly to players. When Udoka was a player himself, he was a very tough-minded role player. He didn't mind getting into fights. He would confront people. He'd get in their face. He's going to bring a little bit of that to a team that really, really wants that. It's going to be a stark contrast between him and Brad Stevens. And I think they're just going to want to hear everything this guy's saying, a little bit like Paul wanted to hear everything Kevin Garnett was saying. So they're going to want to hear everything this new coach says to them about playing defense and how defense creates offense and moving the ball. And Jason, we spent the whole summer together at the Olympics bonding, and we talked about everything I want you to do. And now let's pick up on that. Let's lead by example, play both ends of the floor, be a facilitator. You're such a good passer. Let's see more of that. Make sure that Jalen feels like he's a key star right there with you. All these kinds of things. I just think everybody's going to be really receptive to these kinds of statements. You see it all the time in every sport. I just think if they're going to have a breakthrough year, this is going to be it.
So another buddy of ours here on this program, Ben Rohrbach for Yahoo, does a great job and wrote an article that Paul Pierce actually shared to his 4 million plus followers on Twitter. Paul Pierce, the Boston Celtics legend and Hall of Famer, was better than you think. Now, in fairness, I haven't read the article yet. I'm sure that Ben backs this up statistically, but just seeing the headline, my initial instinct was, I mean, if you're not a Celtics fan, probably, but if you're a Celtics fan, you watched him for 15 years. I think he's probably exactly as good as we think. But from a league-wide perspective, I'll defer to you because I know what I think of Paul. I know what Evan thinks of Paul. It was Paul Pierce better than we even remember with regard to, especially here in the NBA's 75th anniversary season and where he fits into that top 75 and he belongs. He's one of them. Where, what was he better than he gets credit for?
I totally agree with you. The perspective thing. If you're in Boston, I think everybody knows exactly how good he was, and there is no underrating him. And everybody knows the curve of his career and the ups and downs he had, and then how he ended up basically being their point man against LeBron in those years when they were contending. And it was, Kevin Garnett changed the Celtics, but they were able to have some success because Pierce was able to neutralize LeBron James, who was on his way to becoming the best player of his generation, maybe ever, depending on how you are in that argument. So I think what you wouldn't know if you didn't live in Boston about Paul Pierce is the competitiveness and the fact that he and Kevin and Ray really helped save the NBA at a time when it was being hijacked by young players coming in. What we're seeing with Ben Simmons right now, a guy that acts as if he's entitled and hasn't shown improvement and yet wants to be treated as if he has shown it. There was a lot of that going on in the NBA and, before the Celtics traded for Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett. And you even saw it with the Celtics when they were losing 18 games in a row in the season before that trade, and the young players were driving Paul crazy. And just guys who were coming in as teenagers, getting big money up front, thinking they had it all figured out, and not really understanding what it takes to win a championship, wanting to be the man as Michael Jordan had been, just having all these false premises of what it's all about. And when the Celtics came together, these three guys who had each led their teams in scoring but hadn't done anything as a team, and they came together and they said, look, we're going to sacrifice scoring and offensive stats in order to win. They set an entirely new model. And everybody else ever since then has tried to follow what they did. They changed the mold of how stars are supposed to be in that era. And I know people complain a lot about LeBron and other players today putting together their own teams. but their hearts are in the right place when they do it. They're putting together these teams saying, I don't want to put together a team where I average 35 points a game and lose. I want to put together a team where I average 25 a game and win. And for all the grief Kevin Durant took for going to the Warriors, he went there to win. He didn't go there to dominate individually, which was always the big crime against basketball that was happening before Paul and Ray and Kevin. So I think if you're not from Boston, I don't think you understand just how important that was for the NBA, that they sort of renewed the old Celtics vows by coming together. But here in Boston, I think everybody knows it and really takes it for granted when they look at Paul. That's who he is.
I want to ask you where he fits into that top 75, but it probably feels like an impossible task to even estimate that without actually sitting there and making a list.
Well, let's do this quick because Ben, I read the article, so
okay. All right. Well, look, somebody prepared for the show.
Ben threw him in. Well, we'll make this easier.
Yeah. Okay.
Ben threw him in the top 50. Is Paul Pierce a top 50 player in the history of the NBA? Because he was. I'm not sure if he threw him in. Like I might be misquoting here, but I think he says that he's a top 50 player. I'm pretty sure in the or it's like around the top 50. So that's the question: is Paul Pierce a top 50 player in the history of basketball?
I'm inclined to put him in that bottom third. That's just where off the top of my head I would see him, and there's no criticism to that.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about all the guys that won more championships. They have better circumstances than he had for a lot of his career, but that's just the reality. When they were in that position, they cashed in and they won more championships. Guys maybe who didn't come in for the first part of their career looking to score, but were better teammates than Paul was over the first part of his career before Doc knocked him around and got him to see the reality of how you're supposed to win, how you're supposed to play. I mean, Paul did not have a good reputation in the first part of his career. He just didn't. He was seen as a selfish player. He probably wouldn't agree with that assessment, but that's how he was seen. He had a bad time in the series against Indiana when he didn't seem like he was a mature leader at all. And they lost a playoff series that they should have won. That went on Paul. There are lots of great players who've had those kinds of experiences. Even LeBron's had them, Kobe's had them. So I guess maybe that's kind of unfair to point that out. But nonetheless, I would say it speaks a lot to Paul that he could win one championship and be on that list. I think it speaks to how great he was that with only one championship, he belongs in that top 75.
I do want to point out the quote because I don't want to misquote Ben. It's a great article. Go read it if you have the chance. The quote directly is his legacy is unlike any other player not considered among the 50 greatest players in history. So, and he goes on to say Pierce is one of 15 players with 25,000 points, 7,500 rebounds, and 4,500 assists. He's reached 4 conference finals, 2 finals, and won 1 title. The list of players who can match that resume includes only Garnett, Havlicek, James O'Neal, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, Tim Duncan, Moses Malone, Hakeem Olajuwon, and Oscar Robertson. So, I mean, rarefied air for sure for Paul Pierce. And I guess the question would become, because again, Ben raises this, and this is a great question. If Paul Pierce doesn't get traded and plays a couple more years with Boston, he's probably the leading scorer in the Celtics history. By just having that, does that change his status at all? Because if, playing, it's like Dirk Nowitzki playing your entire career with one team and having all these team accolades because he's, Mr. Dallas Mavericks might elevate him instead of going other places. I mean, of course, that title run, I think is like the most underappreciated title run of the past 25, 30 years. It's really unbelievable what Dirk did with that team to get to the NBA finals and then beat the Heat. But I find it interesting that, if you consider the fact that, Pierce got traded, but if he didn't, would be the all-time leading scorer in Boston Celtics history. That might put him in a slightly different category just because it would be the all of the one team sort of thing. So I'm not sure if that changes your mind at all or anything.
I mean, for me, it wouldn't change it. I mean, it would be an amazing achievement to do that, but it wouldn't change it because I already think of him as a tremendous scorer. And those kind of stats, I don't know how much they correlate because the games were so different. Sure, it would mean a lot, but you already think of Paul as the great scorer of the modern age, and you can argue Paul or Larry, all of that. I do think it's important to point out the rebounding, the assists. Paul was a tremendous passer and playmaker, and you really saw it over the second half of his career, the way he could set up others. Just not a selfish player. It's a tale of two halves, his career. He learned the hard way over the first half and he cashed in over the second half. And by the end, he goes to the Wizards, and now he's like the old hand who's teaching them how to win and making the big shots at the end, when you remember how he ended his career with them. And it's just a total turnaround.
Not to cut you off, but the NBA Twitter account put out the top 34 plays of Paul Pierce's career. Mm-hmm. And, they, just like highlight after highlight, and it's basketball porn as a Celtics fan, but the number one play NBA career was that stupid jumper to end his career as a Wizard. Like, please, that's the top play of his entire career. It's not even the Celtic uniform.
Yeah, that's somebody who doesn't live in Boston put that together, probably.
Stupid.
Yeah, anyway. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. Look, wherever you rank him, I think everybody's got to agree he's one of the top 75 players. Everybody should agree that he was part of changing the negative trend into a positive one for the NBA and setting it up so that there was a moral equivalency that was greatly threatened before he came along. And just this example he set of that an old dog can learn new tricks, that he and Ray Allen both became defenders because they were put into a different environment. It's just helped me understand all sorts of players in the NBA and wonder about who they would be if they were in different places, or wonder about how lucky Kawhi Leonard was that he started off with the Spurs as opposed to if he'd started with the Memphis Grizzlies or the Phoenix Suns, the bad Phoenix Suns or something like that. Well, we think about him the same. So much of this is being in the right situation, but then when you're in that situation, what do you do with it? And Paul clearly made the most of it.
So I'm just sort of, I'm thinking on the fly here. So there may be a better comparison to make, and by all means shout it out, but I'm just thinking back to the conversation the two of you were just having. Evan asking, was Paul Pierce a top 50 player? You saying you'd be more inclined to put him in the lower third, in part because of guys' rings, the number of rings that they won that probably belong in the top 50. A guy who was a top 50 player when the NBA at 50 happened 25 years ago. Their eras crossed over, their time in the league crossed over. They've both gone on to be analysts. They've been on the jump. They've both been in the news fairly recently for not so great reasons. But one big difference, or a couple big differences in their careers, Paul Pierce was the man, had one ring, was probably, without looking it up, statistically superior, though they had some comparable statistical seasons for sure. The other was the sidekick, great player, had more rings. How do you compare Paul Pierce and Scottie Pippen when you're ranking the top 75?
Oh, I think I'd put Scottie Pippen above Paul because of the defense that Scottie played that contributed to all those championships. And they weren't going to win those championships until Scottie came along and became that great second player. And Paul was the second player in Boston with Kevin Garnett. I mean, he was the leading scorer, and they could not have won without Paul. There's no doubt. And he was MVP of the finals. Something that Scottie Pippen wasn't able to do playing alongside Michael Jordan. But when you hear people talk about what Scottie Pippen meant to them and his playmaking, and he just did everything. And he was a very good scorer on top of it. but he was a bit of a Bill Russell at his position, Scottie Pippen, and that was in an era of real hard play, and you had to play really hard defenses, a very physical style, and they were contending year after year. This would be where a skeptic would point out that Scottie Pippen benched himself when he didn't get the last shot playing alongside Kukoc.
Yeah.
And that's a very fair statement to make. But Paul had his moments too.
This year, by the way, Tony Kukoc.
Yeah. But Paul had his moments too. Nothing that egregious, never that egregious. But I would just say that the run that Scottie Pippen had, doing these indispensable things, some of the hardest things to do on the basketball court, I would put him ahead of Paul. And again, it's not a knock on Paul. I think Scottie Pippen's just one of the great players of all time.
Look, Scottie's the best defensive player maybe in the history of the NBA, and Paul Pierce is maybe the best elbow jump shooter in the history of the NBA. So we got a little bit of that going on. I can't believe we've gone this far in this podcast, and we've talked about how unselfish Paul was, and we haven't dropped the money quote from the entire article about Gary Welch.
That was great.
That was absolutely brutal, but to his credit, it was like, what was he supposed to do? Those teams.
Poor Yuri, though, hit 20 years later.
I know.
Hit and run in the middle of the Mannix article.
I couldn't believe. I mean, the quote went viral in about 2 seconds because somebody got a hold of it, and all of a sudden, everybody just started laughing their ass off because it was. I mean, it's one of those things that it's funny because it's true. It's like, yeah, what else did you want him to do in those particular teams? And that's like finding Paul's place in history is funny because you look at some guys like, you know, like as an example, nobody I think in there. I mean, I could be wrong about this. But nobody's going to say, even though he won a ring, Paul Pierce is not better than Charles Barkley. Like Charles Barkley, to his credit, you know, I love the quote of like, you know, if I played in the NBA today, I would arrive in a spaceship. I'd be making so much money. Was
two guys that didn't want to be role models, by the way.
Yeah, right. It was one of the guys, you know, a complete unicorn. I mean, you talk about, you know, Zion, you know, now, I mean, if you're a young listener in this podcast, you have not watched young Charles Barkley, I highly recommend you do so, because a guy at 6'4", and I don't care what he's listed at, he's not 6'6", he's much shorter than that. But what he was able to do in terms of leading the league in rebounding is truly amazing, but yet doesn't have a ring. Then you look at some contemporaries of Paul Pierce, like a Tracy McGrady or a Vince Carter, guys that were great scorers but never got over the hump. Paul is like that, but if that guy ended up on a better team with better players, like you mentioned, you know, Kawhi, if he ends up in Memphis instead of San Antonio, is he's the Kawhi Leonard we know now? Like if he doesn't hang out with Chip England and have Greg Popovich as his coach and all the unbelievable assistants they've had through there, is he the same guy? And it's all about, and this comes down to whatever sport you want to talk about. And it's, you know, we talked about it with Mac Jones, we talked about it with everybody. Your situation in any league totally matters. And Paul, his early career, trying to make a name for himself, then all of a sudden the league shifts and he's by himself. And then to his credit, comes back and totally changes himself and becomes a Hall of Famer. He would have been a Hall of Famer anyway, but becomes an NBA champion because of it. So I find it interesting to talk about his selfishness and his selflessness, and then have that quote, and then compare him to other guys in that era that were also considered selfish. I mean, you know, T-Mac and Vince Carter, I mean, that should have worked. That should have worked. You had two guys that were absolutely dominant wing players, young, very talented, but it just didn't work out because egos got in the way. Paul's one of the guys that didn't let his ego get in the way and got out of there. So like you could, as you look at his contemporaries and guys that will be with him maybe in that top 75, you know, the one thing he has over some of those guys is that ring, because of the fact that he, again, as you said, he was one of the few examples you can teach an old dog new tricks. And you look at his place among NBA legends and contemporaries, and to Adam's point and to Ben Rohrbach's point, he probably doesn't get mentioned enough, those other guys, just because of, I don't know, not as much flash, like his ground bound style. Like he wasn't like the highest jumper or the fastest guy on the floor, but like if you ask anybody that actually follows basketball, his footwork may be one of the best of his entire generation, to be frankly honest about it. I mean, that's how he killed everybody, was impeccable footwork from start to finish, basically.
No, when you would watch Paul drive, first of all, he looked like he was moving half as fast as the great athletes, right? When he had the ball and he'd make moves. And yet the defenders would just be falling sideways because they were falling for his fakes. He was very efficient with them. And then when he was on the move in this era when guys are just flying to the basket and like birds, like they're lighter than air, he was like watching a Mack truck jumping over a ravine, kind of like there was this, he had such mass to him. He was so strong and not athletic in the modern sense, but plenty athletic to get things done because he had so much skill. He had such a great handle and he was able to trick people. And then the competitiveness that he had, Doc Rivers would say that before and after every practice, Paul would want to play guys one-on-one, for money, basically, just games, competition, and just take on everybody. And he wanted to do that all the time. That was kind of what he lived for. And other guys like Rondo didn't want to do it. They didn't want to put their reputation at risk as a young player, but Paul really wanted to. Ray Allen really wanted to also. Kevin Garnett changed the team, but he didn't want to take the big shots. And they had to talk him into shooting a lot of times. That's why Paul was so important on those teams. It's sort of the opposite of the Scottie Pippen and Michael Jordan thing, where Scottie didn't get a chance to take those shots. And then when he finally thought he should have had the chance, he didn't want to play because the shot was going to Tony Kukoc. Well, Kevin Garnett was the best player on the team, changed the whole culture of the team. But when it came down to winning the game, Kevin Garnett was not the one that was going to take the shot or that wanted to take the shot. But Paul and Ray surely did. And so it's just a little bit of a different dynamic there. And Evan, I was with the Dream Team in '92 in Barcelona. I covered all the games. And FIBA, the International Basketball Federation, measured every player and put the true heights down. And on the roster, Charles Barkley was 6'4" and 5/8". That was the FIBA measurement. So this guy, in an era of 7-foot centers and 6'11" power forwards, led the league in rebounding, and he did it without blocking out. He did not block out as a rebounder. He would just jump straight up and get the rebound. He was so strong you couldn't knock him off, and so explosive he could go up there and get it. And then 6'4" and 5/8", he was out rebounding all the 7-footers.
It's wild. One more quick break here for the show. Today's show powered by the Legends brand, an athlete-owned apparel brand that's popping up seemingly everywhere these days, folks, including many pro locker rooms, and some of today's top athletes are wearing it as well. Legends is owned in part by athletes. Steve Nash, of course, the head coach of the Brooklyn Nets, Matt Barnes, Baker Mayfield, NFL legend, local hero Willie McGinnis, part of this as well, even former Celtic Marcus Morris Sr., among many others. Legends makes high-performance apparel with a style and comfort that you will want to wear all day. For those of you that are watching this show, on YouTube, Evan, he's been living in this Legends sweatshirt since it arrived in the mail. I'm wearing a Legends t-shirt right now. I don't know if you can see the little logo right here. Ian, I got to ask you, I mean, this package came in the mail, and I took this t-shirt out of the bag, and some people want to wash clothes before they put it on. I put it right on. Put this t-shirt right on. Have you ever worn a cloud? I mean, this is how comfortable this t-shirt is. I'm not even, it sounds ridiculous. I'm not exaggerating. I put it on. I just went, oh, all right. Wow. I mean, it's soft. It's like wearing a silk robe, except obviously it's not silk, doesn't have to be. Feels that good. And Evan, like I said, I can't remember the last time that I saw him on one of these Zoom conferences that he wasn't wearing this sweatshirt.
Well, I'll just tell you, this thing, I look, I sell clothes for a living. This is what I do. So this is right in my wheelhouse. This hoodie, I usually would not spend a lot of money on hoodies. I would spend money for this hoodie. It is my favorite thing currently in my rotation of clothes that I wear. I just got a puppy a couple weeks ago, and obviously you have these early morning bathroom breaks with your new puppy. Mm-hmm. It is the first thing I put on before I go out the door is this hoodie. It is super warm, super soft, super comfortable. And you can't really tell right now, but it fits like a glove. Like it's really like a tailored fit to me. So I can wear it both casually, I can dress it down, put on a pair of sweatpants, obviously, and slum around the house, or I can, throw with a pair of jeans, throw a blazer on over it and go out in town. Like it's got a lot of flexibility to it. It just feels amazing. And I live in this thing, and we both got in the same package, Adam. I got this hoodie, a t-shirt, and the shorts.
Yeah.
And I guess my only question on the shorts, and this might, make people laugh. So like the shorts are awesome. They're like the perfect length, but like, I think there's like an underwear built into the short, and I'm not quite sure if you're supposed to like free ball it in there or if I'm supposed to wear like underwear or not.
Can we use that expression on the show?
What?
Can we use that expression on the show?
We just did. Whether it happened or not.
Oh, what are you going to do now?
I know. But I'll just say this. I have tried it both ways because I feel like I owe it to legends to try it both ways. And It's comfortable either way. So this is a athletic, like leisure brand that is more than just leisure. If you catch my drift, it's amazing. I had somebody in my DMs immediately after I posted some Instagram story and asked me what the deal was. And I had to give him our little promo code, which Adam's going to tell you in a minute, to get 20% off your deal, because he was like, I got to have that. Is it as comfortable as they say? Is it as nice as they say? And I just had to say yes. I wasn't expecting to actually fall in love with this, but I absolutely fell in love with this hoodie. You should get one today, no doubt.
Well, Ian, it's not just Evan. I put on my Legend sweatshirt when I take my 3-year-old son out in the yard for his morning poop break as well, just to be, is that not the way it works? Visit legends.com today and see why athletes everywhere are swapping out their big box brands for Legends apparel, folks. Use code BEAT20. That is BEAT20. Save 20% off your first order. Again, that is legends.com, promo code BEAT20. Offer ends October 10th. So about a month away at this point. Really, we like to goof around here, but incredibly soft, comfortable material that we highly encourage. But in talking about the Celtics and this Celtic themed Hall of Fame class, I think we've done enough. If one can ever do enough, Ian, on Paul Pierce and obviously the KG tie-in. Let's talk just a little bit before we let you go about the other two members of this class that have ties to Boston. That is, of course, Bill Russell and Mike Gorman. I guess my question for Bill Russell is, and getting up here for the second time, obviously went in as a Hall of Famer many years ago as a player, well-deserved, and now going in as a coach where he was also a champion. Will he be flipping anyone off this time as he did in the crowd when Tommy Heinsohn was up there at the podium? Or is he going to keep it a little more reserved for the television audience?
I'd be very disappointed if he doesn't, right? I mean, you do it the first time. That's what people expect. That's what they're coming to see. You got to give them what they want. I mean, Bill Russell deserves to be in there as a coach alone for what he did with the Celtics. It may be impossible for people to realize just how important that was at that time in the 1960s for a black man to not only coach a pro team, which hadn't happened before, but then to lead that team to championships. And then to do it while also playing the most important role in the biggest games. And no assistant coaches, really none of the help that you had before that you have today. It's just a completely different environment. And to know that if he failed at it, if it didn't work out, that everybody would have said it was because of race, that he was inferior, all the terrible things that would have been said. So imagine the pressure he was feeling, or that a person like him would be feeling at that time, becoming the first black man to be a head coach, and knowing everything that was riding on it. And then to see it through and actually surpass all the expectations with a team that really wasn't supposed to be winning anymore. I just think it's a phenomenal achievement. It stands up with the greatest things that have happened in sports, in the last however many years. And he definitely belongs in the Hall of Fame as a coach.
Yeah, no question. And then, when you have Russell, of course, Pierce, and then I'm sure we'll get to Mike Gorman at some point. You got three pillars of the Boston Celtics in terms of, eras. And then you have Gorman, who's just all over the place in terms of starting, in the 80s and then still going today, which
4
is
decades of doing it.
truly amazing. It's been fun to have Mike on this show just because it's for me, a childhood dream, and just interviewing him and talking with him. And, he just has great perspective on a lot of things. And like yourself, Ian, with the way you're able to contextualize some of the things in the NBA, Mike's very similar with that. And, talking about anything in Celtics history, whether it's Bill Russell, Larry Bird, Havlicek, up to now. I mean, Mike's just just a Celtics historian at this point. It's amazing, but it's awesome that Boston's so represented at this point.
And taking nothing away from Mike. Mike's incredible. He's been on the show a number of times. He's amazing, and it's so well deserved, obviously. But I think he would probably echo this. It feels unfortunate, for lack of a better word, sad in some ways that he and Tommy Heinsohn aren't going in together, as broadcasters. I know Tommy Heinsohn's already in there as a player, in there as a coach, and should be, and I believe will be in there as a commentator. I don't know why the hell it didn't happen sooner or hasn't happened yet. The guy, again, before he got sick and passed, was at it for 3 decades strong and commentated national games. It's not like he was limited to the Celtics. I mean, he's, a fixture, a voice on television broadcasts for decades. And it's always been, and again, Mike Gorman said this a number of times. It's, for 4 decades, practically anyway, it was, Mike and Tommy. It feels like they should be going into the Hall of Fame together, and while impossible now, up there at the podium together and joking around and just being them and doing them. And I don't know, as a fan, I feel somewhat robbed of that moment.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree, but I would just really love to, I completely agree. Tommy Heinsohn should be in as a commentator. And I think he would probably be the first to be in all 3 spots if he did. But Mike Gorman is just, there's more to him than just this idea of all the years and all the great things he's informed us about. It's the energy and the sparkle that he continues to bring after all these years. It always seems a little bit new to him. Even now, he just brings such joy and energy to his work. And when you're watching the game, you're not thinking about, wow, this guy's been here for so long. You're not thinking about all the things he's seen. If you go to other cities and you see some of the older broadcasters, you do think that. You're thinking, oh, this guy's still doing the job because he's got a name, but he shouldn't be doing it anymore. And Mike's just the opposite. Mike earns his place every single time he works. And it's just an amazing achievement to not be bored after all this time. And think about all the bad basketball that this guy's watched and endured. And he never let it bring him down to that level. He always rose above it. I mean, the Celtics were awful for years. And this was a guy that he was around for the Larry Bird years. He knew what the real thing was. And he was around Red Auerbach, and he grew up in Boston. He told me about sneaking into the Celtics games. They would sneak in and to watch the Bill Russell teams. And so he knew the real thing, and yet the guy's such a pro and has such energy, and there's a magnetism to him. I'm just in awe of Mike Gorman as a professional. And part of being a professional is it's having a professional approach and taking it seriously. But you also have to have that joy to you. You have to have that energy to you and that love for what you're doing. And that just comes across all the time with him. It should not be taken for granted. It's such a rare thing, not just in broadcasting, but in everything anybody could ever do in life. And to me, he's a real model of how you should try to go about your job, no matter what you do.
Well, I also think too, and great features have been written about this in recent years. I want to say Adam Himmelsbach of the Globe wrote one a couple of years back as well. And it has nothing to do with this Hall of Fame case or anything like that. It speaks to obviously kind of what a unique individual or how unique the story is for Mike Gorman. You know, you think about like, he's up there in age. I don't know exactly how old he is off the top of my head, but he's not a young man at this point in time, still very much with it, still very adept, still does an incredible job, the energy that you talked about. But you think about, you know, quote unquote, younger commentators. And when I say that, I mean like 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, you know, guys that are in the NBA or the pro level of whatever the sport. And for like, I know as someone who works in the industry, so many of these guys have, you know, you dream about being a broadcaster when you're younger, after you realize that you're not good enough to be a professional athlete. And then you go to college and you train for it, and you get out of school and it's minor leagues or working your way up, or maybe some are lucky enough to kind of fall into it, but it's not like go off to the Navy and, you know, serve your country and all of these different things Mike Gorman did before it was, well, what do I do now? And then all of a sudden, you know, becomes a broadcaster, you know, doing college sports and, you know, working in Rhode Island, and then, you know, Big East, and going on to obviously do what he has done since. I just think that, you know, that era of broadcasting is, you know, times have changed. It's behind us. It's different now. It doesn't work that way anymore. And I don't know. Again, it has nothing to do with his Hall of Fame case. It doesn't add to his legacy necessarily. I just find it interesting.
It adds to his perspective, though. It's part of what makes him so special, that he hasn't just lived in this one world and he's obtuse and he doesn't see the rest of the world. He can't relate to other people. He brings an outsider's point of view to it, even though he's the ultimate insider. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I was at Sports Illustrated and I'd be around the Celtics all the time, and whenever I wanted some perspective, he'd be one of the guys I'd go talk to in the press room before a game. And he, you know, you could get real honest advice, a real honest take from him. Yeah. The guy, he's not a homer. But so fair, no cheap shots with Mike, but honest assessments of people. I think the greatest thing about him is that he's always viewed the people he's told you about as people. They're not cartoon characters to him. They're real human beings. And over the years, he's gotten to know them as people. He's connected to them as people. What made his partnership with Tommy Heinsohn so great was that you saw two guys. They were more than the announcers. You really saw a relationship between them, an odd couple kind of relationship. And when Tommy would start ripping on the referees, if Mike thought that Tommy was wrong about it, as he even was, you would hear Mike wouldn't say anything. He would just go quiet and just let Tommy say what he was going to say, and then pick up, okay, the Cavaliers inbound now. You know, he'd move on to the next thing. And but what a great chemistry between them, what a great friendship between them, and that came across all the time and their relationship.
No, it's true. And I guess just to put a bow on this, like I don't know Paul Pierce personally. I certainly don't know Bill Russell personally, but you know, having had many conversations with Mike and considering him a friend and having him on this show, and Evan's talked to him as well. He's just such a genuinely nice guy, which is, you know, I having worked in this business as we all do for as long as I have, and Ian, you even longer, and Evan, you've certainly seen some things and talked to some people like that's a relatively rare thing to come across. Someone who is genuinely nice versus, you know, playing nice, or, you know, you have a nice conversation with them. Like to be a genuinely nice person in this business, when it's, you know, this industry, and it's true of a lot of businesses, but this industry, you know, it can turn you cynical, it can turn you negative, it can turn you whatever, and he's just always been above all that, and just a real pleasure to talk to.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much pressure that people feel, and it's probably more today than ever because of social media, and you get picked apart for everything you do. The pressure has never seemed to affect him. I'm sure he's been criticized over the years. Mike, I'm sure mistakes have been made and he's been held to account for them, because everybody makes them. It's impossible, especially when you're reacting on the fly on television all the time, as he's had to do. And yet the pressure, he's never borne the pressure. You never can tell that he's never taken himself seriously. he takes the work very seriously in a joyful way, but he never thought of himself as anything special, never acted like that, which makes him all the more special.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add to this is the guy that you guys, everybody's been watching on TV for the past 40 years is the same. He's that guy. He really is that person. And I remember the first time meeting him with our CEO, Nick Gelso, outside TD Garden. I was like kind of starstruck because I was a young kid and I was like, oh my God, that's Mike Gorman. And he's just the most genuine person I think I've met, maybe like in the industry. He's just the nicest person on air. You're like, wow, this guy just seems like a really good dude. He is that person. The person you see on TV is no different than he is in real life. And it is just, to me, when I first time I had to interview him, I wanted to ask him about old college basketball because everybody forgets that the send it in Jerome call from Bill Raftery, which is super famous at this point. The guy sitting next to him was Mike Gorman on that game. And I talked to him about it and how I'm like, do you ever feel like you get lost in the shuffle on this? Because they only play that one bite, but yet you're sitting there right next to him. And he goes, no, because Bill, that it was so authentic, Bill, at that point. And the fact that he could just recall everything that he's ever seen basically in a basketball game. It's like, the recall of LeBron or the recall of Bill Russell, who can like go back and just be like, game 7, 5 minutes ago, this Mike can do that too. He's just a special human being. And again, as Celtics fans, we're very fortunate to have both Sean Grandy as the radio play-by-play guy. We're very fortunate to have Cedric Maxwell as his partner in crime on the radio side. Those guys are unbelievably talented. Yes. And then Mike Gorman for 40 years is just unbelievable. He is amazing. And if you ever get the opportunity to meet Mike, you'll notice right away he's just as genuine as he seems.
Again, Hall of Fame weekend. Congrats to all the inductees, most especially because we're biased. Paul Pierce, Bill Russell, and Mike Gorman, and should be a lot of fun. Looking forward to watching those speeches. And as Evan said earlier off the top, looking forward to, somebody saying something incredibly controversial right after we record this show and, having that be the narrative that carries the rest of the week while we've missed it. I talked about
Marc Gasol got traded. That's something that's happened. I've been keeping an eye on it. Marc
Gasol got traded. Where to?
The Grizzlies.
Good. Fitting. Why not? He can be there for Tony Allen's number retirement. It'll be great. Again, talking about how great, how nice, how kind, how forthcoming and giving with his time that Mike Gorman is. All of those same things are true of this man, Ian Thomsen. Truly, one of the real treats in the business and industry, and always grateful to have you on this show, Ian. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Adam. Hey, I got one Paul Pierce story. If we
please go for it.
Fire away, buddy.
I mean, it's just he'd always have you cracking up about things you weren't expecting. But I remember talking to JJ Barea early in his NBA career with the Mavericks after a game. They were playing in Boston. And I said to him, you were a star at Northeastern for 4 years. What's it like for you to come back here? We were just chatting in the locker room after the game. And he said, yeah, it's great. I used to try to come over to Celtics games all the time when I played at Northeastern. I love Paul Pierce. I loved watching him. And I go, did you ever meet him? He goes, well, I went up to him once I got into the league to tell him how much I liked him. So a couple of days later at practice, I saw Paul and I go, hey, I heard JJ Barea came up to you. And he goes, who? I go, JJ Barea. He goes, who's that? And I go, the guy from the Mavericks, the little guy, went to Northeastern. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. I go, well, he said you were his favorite player and he used to come see you play all the time. I said, what'd you say to that? And he said, I told him I never heard of him before. And I'm like, why would you do that? The guy was a star at Northeastern. I mean, here he is. He's like looking up to you. And Pierce goes, hey, I'm Paul Pierce. I'm Boston Celtics. I'm not gonna be worried about Northeastern. What do you want from me? Like he was like making funny about it. But you get that kind of stuff all the time from him. That kind of attitude that would catch you by surprise. He just wasn't like the typical role model.
Yeah, humility wasn't really a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
What want me to do? Pass to Yuri Welch? No way.
Yeah.
Ian Thomsen, Evan Valenti, I'm Adam Kaufman. Thanks for joining us here on Celtics Beat. We'll catch you again after Hall of Fame weekend. And remember, basketball next month. It's a thing. It's coming, folks. Looking forward to it. More Celtics talk.